Bread, tea, more bread. That was the Victorian working-class diet. Forget images of hearty roasts and abundant meals. Working-class Victorians lived primarily on bread, weak tea, and whatever else they could afford, which usually wasn't much. A family might spend 12 shillings weekly on food, with most going to bread alone. The diet was monotonous, inadequate, and often outright starvation. Meat appeared weekly at most, vegetables when affordable, dairy rarely. Children grew up malnourished as standard. The class divide in Victorian food was stark. While wealthy Victorians ate elaborate 5-course dinners, working families calculated how many times they could reuse tea leaves before throwing them away. Let's explore what working-class Victorians actually ate and how they survived on so little. Bread. The foundation. Bread was everything. Victorian working-class families built their entire diet around it. Most food money went to bread, and bread filled the gaps when nothing else was available. Victorian bread was different from modern bread, denser, heavier, more filling. A loaf provided more calories and stayed edible longer. This bread kept working people functional through 12-hour factory shifts. The quality varied by price. Better bread was made with wheat flour, cost more, and the working poor couldn't always afford it. Cheaper bread mixed in other grains or fillers. The very cheapest bread was barely nutritious but filled stomachs. Families ate bread at every meal. Breakfast was bread, perhaps with dripping if they had it. Midday meal included bread. Evening tea centered on bread with whatever could be added, cheese if lucky, just butter or dripping more commonly. When money ran out before week's end, families survived on bread alone. Dry bread, stale bread, bread soaked in weak tea to soften it. The monotony was soul-crushing, but starvation was the alternative. Tea, weak and reused. Tea was the other staple, though calling it tea is generous. Working families reused tea leaves multiple times until they yielded almost nothing. Fresh tea was expensive. Families bought small quantities and stretched them as far as possible. The first brew might resemble actual tea. By the third or fourth reuse, it was barely colored water with faint tea flavor. The weak tea served practical purposes beyond hydration. It warmed people in cold homes. It made dry bread slightly easier to swallow. It created the illusion of a proper meal when poured into cups at the table. Tea drinking was universal across classes, but the quality gap was enormous. Wealthy households used fresh tea leaves for each pot and threw them away after one use. Working families reused the same leaves for days. Even children drank tea. Milk was expensive and often unavailable in urban areas. Tea, weak as it was, replaced milk for working-class children who rarely tasted fresh dairy. Dripping. Liquid gold. Meat dripping, the fat that drained from roasted meat, was precious in working-class households. Families who could afford Sunday meat saved every drop of fat for the week ahead. The dripping was cooled in bowls and solidified. It could then be spread on bread like butter or used for frying. Bread and dripping was standard working-class breakfast and sometimes dinner too. The dripping provided calories and flavor that bread alone lacked. A thin layer of meat fat transformed plain bread into something resembling an actual meal. For children who rarely saw real meat, dripping was their primary animal fat source. Families without Sunday meat had no dripping. They used cheaper alternatives, lard if they could afford it, or nothing at all. Dry bread was meal for the very poorest. If you're still here after learning about bread and dripping, subscribe for more Victorian working-class reality. The Sunday joint. Meat appeared once weekly at most, the Sunday joint that families stretched as far as possible through the week. Sunday was when working families who could manage it bought the cheapest cuts of meat. A small joint cost several shillings, significant expense from weekly wages around 12 to 15 shillings total. The joint was roasted Sunday, providing the week's only hot meat meal. The family ate it with potatoes and whatever vegetables they could afford. This was the week's highlight meal. Monday meant cold meat from Sunday's leftovers. Tuesday and Wednesday featured stew made from scraps, bones, and vegetables stretched with bread and potatoes. By Thursday, families were eating vegetable-based meals bulked with flour or rice. The poorest families couldn't afford even this. They bought the cheapest offal, liver, kidneys, hearts, or bones for making broth. A halfpenny's worth of bones could be boiled for soup that had to last days. Potatoes, the cheap fill. After bread, potatoes were most important working-class food. They were cheap, filling, and available year-round in urban markets. Potatoes appeared at almost every meal. Boiled potatoes with bread for breakfast, cold potatoes with bread for midday meal, hot potatoes for evening tea, perhaps with a bit of butter or dripping if lucky. The preparation was simple. Boil them and eat them. Working families rarely had ovens for roasting. Cooking happened in single pots over open fires or small stoves. Potatoes provided crucial calories when other food was scarce. They were more nutritious than bread alone. Families could survive longer on bread and potatoes than on bread by itself. When potato prices rose, as they did during shortages, working families faced genuine crisis. The staple that kept them functional became unaffordable, pushing them from poverty into starvation. Vegetables. When affordable. Vegetables appeared when families could afford them, which wasn't always. Onions were most common vegetable because they were cheap and kept well. They went into stews, soups, and any dish needing bulk. A few onions could flavor an entire pot. Cabbage, carrots, and turnips appeared seasonally when prices dropped. Families bought them in small quantities, a halfpenny or penny's worth at a time, whatever fit the budget that day. Green vegetables like watercress were cheapest, and sometimes only vegetable working families ate regularly. Watercress grew wild near streams and could be gathered free or bought for almost nothing from street vendors. Peas and beans, dried versions, provided protein when meat was impossible. A pot of dried peas could be boiled with bones or scraps to make filling soup that stretched over multiple meals. The rural working class ate better than urban workers regarding vegetables. Rural families might have garden plots where they grew their own potatoes, onions, and cabbage. Urban families depended entirely on purchases. Fish, Friday's option. Fish was slightly cheaper than meat and became Friday's staple for families who could manage it. Red herrings, heavily smoked and salted fish, cost a halfpenny each. They were strongly flavored but provided fish protein cheaply. Broiled on a gridiron and served with bread, they made Friday meal. Fish heads were even cheaper, a farthing bought half a pound. These were boiled into soup with onions and bread. The soup was thin but warm and provided something beyond just bread. Fried fish from street vendors was working-class treat. When families had extra pennies, buying fried fish was affordable luxury. Actual prepared food eaten hot. Coastal working families had better access to fish. They could buy directly from fishing boats before middlemen raised prices. Inland urban families paid more and got fish that was older and less fresh. Cheese. Rare luxury. Cheese was expensive enough that working families bought it in tiny quantities, a few ounces at a time when they could afford it at all. Hard cheese like cheddar could be sliced thinly and made to last. A small piece of cheese with bread elevated a meal above pure subsistence. Children who tasted cheese regularly were relatively fortunate. Cheese provided fat and protein concentrated in small, keepable form. Unlike meat, it didn't spoil quickly. A small cheese piece purchased Saturday could last until midweek with careful rationing. Many working families went weeks without cheese. It was one of those foods that appeared when circumstances allowed, disappeared when money was tight. Its presence or absence marked difference between struggling poverty and desperate poverty. Street food, the alternative. Working people who couldn't cook at home, and many couldn't, bought food from street vendors. This was more expensive than home cooking, but necessary for many. Pies were common street food. Meat pies when affordable, potato pies when not. They cost a penny or two and provided hot, filling food for workers with no way to cook. Fried fish, soup, and hot potatoes were sold from carts and stalls throughout working neighborhoods. Quality varied wildly. Some was decent food at fair prices. Some was made from near-spoiled ingredients sold to people with no choice. Watercress sandwiches, sold by street vendors, provided cheap meal option. A penny bought a watercress and cheese sandwich, affordable working-class lunch. The poorest workers sometimes lived entirely on street food because they had no cooking facilities. Single pots were all many families owned for cooking. No ovens, limited fuel, and no space meant buying prepared food despite the cost. Sugar and butter, rarely seen. Sugar and butter were luxuries most working families couldn't afford regularly. They appeared occasionally, disappeared during hard times. Butter was expensive. Most working families used dripping, lard, or just ate bread dry. Butter on bread was special occasion food. Sunday mornings when father's wages had just arrived and money was least tight. Sugar-sweetened tea and could be added to plain rice or bread for children's meals. But sugar cost money better spent on filling foods. Many working-class children grew up never tasting sugar except at Christmas. Jam or preserves occasionally appeared in better-off working households. Spread thinly on bread, a jar of jam could last weeks and provided sweetness that made monotonous bread more bearable. Milk. Too expensive. Fresh milk was often unavailable to urban working families. The cost was prohibitive, and supply was limited in cities. Rural working families might have access to milk, either from their own animals or purchased from nearby farms. Urban families rarely saw it. What milk was available in cities was expensive and often contaminated. Children in working families grew up without milk. This contributed to rickets, malnutrition, and stunted growth common among working-class Victorian children. When families could afford it, they bought tiny amounts for Sunday tea or for the youngest children. But regular milk consumption was middle-class privilege, not working-class reality. Meal structure. When food was available, working families ate differently from wealthy Victorians. 2 meals daily was common, sometimes just one substantial meal. Breakfast was bread with dripping or butter if available. Tea to drink. Eaten quickly before factory shifts began at dawn. The main meal came after work, evening tea that was actually dinner. This centered on whatever food the family could afford. Bread always, potatoes usually. Meat on Sunday, leftovers and stews early in the week, bread and potatoes or just bread by week's end. Midday, workers might eat bread they brought or buy cheap food from street vendors. Children in factories ate scraps during brief breaks. Elaborate multi-course meals with leisure time were middle-class concepts foreign to working-class reality. Seasonal variations. Summer and autumn offered slightly better eating than winter and spring. Seasonal price drops made some foods briefly affordable. Fresh fruits like cherries appeared in summer, cheap enough that working families could buy small quantities. Children might taste fresh fruit once or twice yearly when it was abundant, and prices crashed. Winter was hardest. Vegetables were expensive. Fuel for cooking cost more. Cold weather increased calorie needs just as food became scarcer and more costly. Spring, the hungry gap, was particularly bad. Winter stores depleted, spring crops not yet available. This was when malnutrition peaked and families struggled most. The stark reality. This was working-class Victorian diet. Bread, weak tea, occasional meat, some potatoes and onions, and constant hunger. Malnutrition was standard, not exceptional. Children grew up stunted. Diseases of poverty and poor diet were universal. Rickets, scurvy, and various deficiency conditions marked working-class bodies visibly. The contrast with wealthy Victorian diet was enormous. While working families calculated how many times they could reuse tea leaves, wealthy households ate multi-course dinners with fresh meat, fish, imported fruits, and elaborate desserts daily. Modern people look at Victorian Britain and see industrial progress, empire, scientific advancement. Working-class Victorians experienced it while barely surviving on bread and tea, watching their children grow up malnourished as accepted fact of working-class life. So, what shocks you most about Victorian working-class food? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this look at Victorian class differences, subscribe for more stories about how ordinary people really lived in the past. Thanks for watching.